Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 18 of Japan Foundation's Pop Culture Series. My name is Shun Inoue with the Japan Foundation's New York office with my arts and culture team. Thank you again for tuning into our episode today, focusing on the topic of survival horror video games. Tonight, we'll be looking at the history, various influences, and the evolution of the survival horror genre, along with exploring what makes these games so appealing to the world. And to do so, we have invited the following esteemed guests who will be providing us with their expertise and presentations. Our first guest and moderator is Dr. Bernard Perron, full professor of film and video game studies at Université de Montréal. He's the author of Silent Hill, The Terror Engine, and the World of Scary Video Games, a study in videoludic horror. He has also co-edited the Video Game Theory Reader 1 and 2, the Routledge Companion to Video Game Studies, as well as Video Games and the Mind, essays on cognition, effect, and emotion. His research concentrates on video games, the horror genre, interactive cinema, along with narration, cognition, and the ludic dimension of narrative cinema. Our second guest is Dr. Ewan Kirkland, senior lecturer in critical studies at the University for the Creative Arts. There, he teaches critical theory to game designers, graphic novelists, and concept artists. Ewan has published extensively on video games, particularly focusing on survival horror and the Silent Hill series. Exploring issues such as storytelling, self-reflectivity, gender, genre, and psychoanalysis, his work has been featured in Games and Culture, Convergence, Gothic Studies, and Camera Obscura. Our third guest is Dr. Dawn Stobart, administrative assistant at the psychology department at Lancaster University. She has completed her doctorate at Lancaster University and is currently focusing on how video games function in a trans and intermediary capacity for a second monograph. Dawn has fingers in many pies, including queer studies, cultural studies, and media studies, as well as a focus on horror and the Gothic. She has an interest in contemporary media, especially in looking at how narrative translates to video games. And our fourth guest today is Mr. Richard Rouse III, Studio Creative Director at Farbridge. Previously, he was the design director and lead at Microsoft Studios, Ubisoft Montreal, Midway, and Surreal Software, working on projects such as The Suffering, State of Decay, The Church in the Darkness, Damage Incorporated, and Odyssey, The Legend of Nemesis. He's also the author of Game Design, Theory and Practice, and is a frequent speaker on game design and interactive storytelling at conferences and universities. As always, we'll begin our program with pre-recorded presentations from each of our guest speakers. Dr. Perron will start us off with his presentation focusing on the history and evolution of survival horror genre, followed by Dr. Kirkland with his presentation on storytelling and narrative in Japanese horror games. Dr. Stobart will then offer her insight regarding some of the influences and inspirations these horror games draw from, and Mr. Rouse will conclude our presentations by showcasing the evolution of game mechanics in the horror game genre over the years. Although we have already received a lot of great questions from our registrants, we will be choosing and answering a few of the live chat questions at the end, so please feel free to ask them in the YouTube live chat during our stream. Also, just please to keep the chat clean and friendly. And with that, let's get right into the presentations, and I'll see you all again later during the Q&A session. Please enjoy.
Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to start today's dark journey to the evolution of survival horror games. We are, can you imagine it, on Friday the 13th, so there's probably no better time to do this than now. The goal of my own talk is to refresh memories and 2 points to landmark, so we have them in mind for the discussion afterwards. I will do so by making a very short and targeted history of horror video games, because the genre is pretty rich. For example, in my own research, I did distinguish 5 periods to trace its history, starting with the first time horror was used for games, to the many games that had horror as theme, to the advance of survival horror itself, to the transition toward a more action-oriented design, and to the virtual future of virtual reality. I will concentrate today on survival horror, as it is the topics of our session. As you know, we did enter the world of survival horror with Resident Evil in '96. It didn't take long once we were in the Spencer Mansion to meet something horrifying and scary, a zombie. Resident Evil is considered to be one of the most significant adult-oriented games to appear in the mid-90s because it was a frightening experience. For instance, if we go back to a review of the time, it's in the French magazine, I'm French, so I'm going back to my own stuff. a pure apprehension. Distress is mercifully orchestrated, and our most unspeakable fear are handled in crescendo. We are afraid of dying without saving, and we are genuinely scared. Resident Evil is the first video game able to immerse yourself in the same universe as the film of Hitchcock and Sam Raimi. That is to say, it makes us experience feelings that we know at the movie but are unprecedented on console. Then to talk about Resident Evil is to talk about survival horror. Because sometimes if we do not know where the label of a genre is coming from, we know it for survival horror. That was made by Capcom marketing team. In Japan, as for other video game genre, the label was used in English on the cover of a trial version and the first release of Biohazard, Resident Evil. The use of English was to bring forth positive international association in the mind of Japanese consumer. So then we had a label. As it's often the case, when a label is appears, it is used to Christian work that was made before we had this label in mind, but also it creates association to the genre that follows. So here, let's trace the reference to the label given to games made before Resident Evil. And it's interesting because it allows us to highlight important works in the genre. So in 1980, the airy labyrinthine journey of its protagonist and the mixture of pursuit and escape make this computer game the forerunner of contemporary survival horror. Here we're talking about Pac-Man. So we have the basis for the maze and the chase and escape at the core of the genre. In 1981, the fear already came home, starting with the first survival horror game, Haunted House for the Atari 2600. There was an arcade game before called Haunted House, but it was more a shooting gallery. Here, with the 3 pieces of magic urn we had to find to get out, that was in the dark, the needs to find matches to lead our way, facing the monster, it's more close to the experience that we had as action adventure games like Resident Evil. In 1981 too, at its art, 3D Monster Maze is the original survival horror game. But here, heart is the good term because the gamer was falling into the lair of a T-Rex and was being chased by it when he was discovered. Being chased by a monster, I do think that's something that we do repeat when we play survival horror. 1983, mid-sculpture turned coder Sandy White created the father of survival horror. Ant Attack marked the very beginning of the survival horror genre. While fleeing giant ants and the possibility to play 2 different player characters, a woman and a man, is giving a glimpse to what Resident Evil will be. 1983, the Resident Evil series propelled survival horror video games into the public consciousness, but the genre has much older roots. As far back as 1982, Paul Norman was crafting a gory action-packed horror pick, Forbidden Forest. Here, this is the term gory that is important, as the blood did splatter when the archer that was killed by giant spider, big frog, flying dragons, or here killer skeleton appear on screen during the game. We can go now to 1988. Although it never received sequel, Project Firestarter stands as the true ancestor of survival horror genre. It's a science fiction horror inspired by Alien, but it wishes to be experienced as an interactive movie, just as Mikami will wish Resident Evil to be experienced 8 years later. 1981. Often touted as being the first true survival horror game, Sweet Home was a top-down adventure and RPG game for the Famicom that only found a release in Japan. This is Capcom publicized inspiration for Resident Evil. They say we did Resident Evil by looking at Sweet Home. There's some element here, they mention the loading screen of doors, inventory, but we still have a top-down view, which is far away from the mise-en-scène that Resident Evil will present. So there's another more important game to consider when we're looking at the advent of survival horror. And it was made in 92. While Alone in the Dark may have been the forefather of the survival horror genre, Capcom Resident Evil series perfected it. And in fact, this is the case, and I think that's how we have to see things. Because Resident Evil is a carbon copy of Alone in the Dark. You're caught in a mansion, the door closed when you get in, you cannot get out. The space is shown through fixed camera angle. There's 2 playable characters. There's scattered items. there is limited inventory, there is puzzle, there is monster. So although everyone was seeing the link between Alone in the Dark and Resident Evil, it took almost 2 decades before Mikami and Capcom did reveal that Alone in the Dark has a very important impact on the way Resident Evil was created. I'm quoting Mikami here. Then I have played Alone in the Dark, which consists of fixed background. It was very interesting because there was a greater expressiveness. The next step has been to adapt this model to Resident Evil. The horror game from Capcom is accordingly transformed into a zombie reinterpretation of the Lovecraftian investigation in Frédéric Reynal's game. Without it, recognized, finally Mikami, Resident Evil would have probably become a first-person shooter, and at one point we know that they were working in the first-person perspective to start with. But again, so with Resident Evil, there's another... So the link between Alone in the Dark, Lovecraft, zombies, inspiration in the making of Resident Evil, put forward a keystone in the story of the genre. And I'm referring here to 2 notions that Martin Picard did emphasize when he studies Japanese survival horror video games. He did refer to the notion of transnationality, referring to the global way in which cultural goods are created, produced, and distributed internationally, and to the notion of intermediality that can account simultaneously for the interaction, mutual remediation, or transformation, and the conceptual conversion between various media in a particular medium or media culture, as well as for the mutation in the discursive, representational, and cultural practice produced by such intermediate relationship. So even if survival horror games were made at the beginning by Japanese companies like Capcom and Konami, they were still heavily influenced by American and European media and culture. So we have to keep that in the landscape of looking at survival horror. But at the same time, they're game and designer that was inspired by Japanese culture, and that did within the range of possibility for the creation of scary experience. So Raccoon City, zombie, that's really American-oriented. Resident Evil became a franchise, we know it, a franchise with its remake now. I think that's the way they're going to do it. But when Resident Evil get out and was popular, other games that follow wanted to take advantage of this popularity and copy the way Resident Evil was made. So Deep Fear was under the water, but that's the same thing that Resident Evil. Dino Crisis, made by Mikami, was changed the zombie for a dinosaur. Carrier was a 3D game, but with still a really military inspiration. Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare, and Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, or more, they do have more gothic influences, but again, they're really close to the mise-en-scène of Resident Evil. Clock Towers is also like that. I do think that a series that we cannot leave aside, and it's nice because it's a way to show this notion of transnationality, because it's much more inspired by stalker film in the States than by Japanese folklore, for instance. 99 is a very important year for the genre because a game came on and it was more than a Resident Evil clone. And you probably know what game I'm talking about, Silent Hill. So again, let's go back to a review of the game at the time. When one might compare Resident Evil with movies like Night of the Living Dead, I would compare Silent Hill with more genuinely disturbing film like The Exorcist, The Shining, and perhaps even Psycho. This is a game that does an amazing job at getting into your head and staying there. So with the fog, the darkness, the monster that can come everywhere. So that's the screenshot that I'm showing you here. The sound design, the switch between nightmares and reality, all those distinctive aspects of Silent Hill open up again, widen the possibility of the genre, and again, give us new avenue to create games. In my work, I did play on the label. So if we're saying that Resident Evil is the survival, is the foundation of survival horror games, we can say that Silent Hill is the foundation of survival terror games. And again, we have the similar distinction between physical and psychological horror, with the zombie and somewhere with we don't know where the danger is coming, we don't see anything, and then we are terrified of what's going to happen next. Silent Hill is also a franchise that's going to be rebooted pretty soon. Hopefully that's going to be good, but it's pretty. We cannot not talk about PT, which is the playable teaser of a game, a Silent Hills game that will not be made, but it's more scary and more influential than many full games that were made in 2014. 2001 is also very important because at one point we do get now to the Japanese-ness of the survival horror with Fatal Frame, that, we're stuck in the Japanese mansion with ghosts coming from anywhere. We have a camera obscura as a weapon that is forcing us to see the foe in our face all the time to get this Fatal Frame to be able to kill it. But again, here I'm quoting Marak book just because it makes a good comparative analysis between Japanese and American horror. And she's talking about Fatal Frame Project Zero in Europe. And she's saying the central figure of the plot of Fatal Frame and the primary source of horror is the angry ghost of Imuru Mansion, the last sacrifice maiden Kiri Imuru. Aesthetically, Kiri's spirit bears a close resemblance to the traditional image of Yurei. She's wearing the white ceremonial kimono, and her long black hair cover her face. So with Fatal Frame, we have all this notion of G-horror that invade American United States afterwards, and showing a new inspiration for terror with the presence of the ghost. And again, for us, the good thing is that, Fatal Frame just became a franchise too. So if you're looking more at Japanese inspiration game, looking at folklore, ghost and demon, we have Siren series that was like a few games. That's not zombie, that's Shibito, so it's not ghost, but it's not zombie at the same time. Kuwan is working on ghost, and then Animusha Tree is working on demon. But again, if I want to finish my talk, because time is running very fast, and to wrap this up in a quick and shocking manners, I cannot go without referring to 2005 and that. We cannot not talk about Resident Evil 4. And for me, in my periodization of the history of genre, this is the end of survival horror. And it's the same thing for Capcom, because they did coin the survival horror label in '96, but then we come in 2005 and they coined another label to talk about their game. So new survival action. Forget survival horror. This is Resident Evil redefined with more menacing enemy, intuitive control. We're far away from the tank control of '96, and intense action-packed gameplay. So insofar as video game as evolves, giving the possibility to use more action. So Capcom is going to this kind of design, and it has influenced other game, because at one point after Resident Evil 4, there's two games that we have to put forward, Dead Space and The Evil Within, which is made by Mikami, that are already much more action-oriented. And then, like I was saying at the beginning in my periodization, there's a kind of, do you fight or you flee? Scary game's going to work on those two avenues. So I want to finish with a little nuance that I find very important to make, and that was underlined by Matthew Ways in his analysis of Clock Tower, Resident Evil, and Dead Rising. What Matthew said is something really nice. All survival horror games are horror games, but not all horror games are survival horror. And again, that's why, we have to make a periodization of the way games are made and are designed. So again, for me, I did go from horror video games. We're stuck with the label horror that came in the cinema. And I'm more thinking about, scary video game is a way to encompass all the scary experience that we're going through, which are, first-person perspective, which for me is really not survival horror. And then, be able to put together all this body of frightening experience together. So thank you. And then we're going to discuss later.
Hi there, my name is Dr. Ewan Kirkland. I teach comics and concept art at the University for the Creative Arts, and I'm going to be talking about storytelling in Japanese horror games. I'm going to start with a quick plug for my book, Video Games and the Gothic. This is a recent publication which includes chapters on Gone Home, BioShock, Night in the Woods, and What Remains of Edith Finch, and it explores the relationship between video games and Gothic fiction. So one title that I found particularly compelling was Haunting Ground, produced by Konami and released in 2005. In my chapter, I explore how this game explicitly draws upon traditions of Gothic fiction in which imperiled heroines find themselves trapped in spooky castles pursued by various adversaries. But Haunting Ground also sets up an odd relationship between the player. The game's heroine is Fiona, an avatar which the player controls. But also at various stages, Fiona appears as a character in cutscenes. And in these points, sometimes we're invited to identify with Fiona as an imperiled heroine, and sometimes we're invited to identify with the characters who are pursuing her. There are also moments in Haunting Ground where the player loses control of the avatar. If Fiona experiences moments of stress or anxiety, then they enter into a panic mode where they start running around, bumping into walls and falling downstairs. And in this moment, the player experiences a sense of rupture from the avatar who they're supposed to be controlling. It's as if Fiona suddenly becomes a character in her own narrative rather than a figure that the player is controlling through the game environment. So I found Haunting Ground a particularly compelling example of the ways in which tropes, traditions, and aesthetics of the Gothic can be incorporated into video games. It also shows the complex relationship between players and avatars that games can establish, and the tensions between the avatar as a character in a narrative which the player has no control over, and the avatar as a figure which the player must navigate through the game environment. Haunting Ground maybe also gestures towards the limits of narrative in video games. It could be argued that the Gothic tropes that this game draws upon are primarily there to establish an experience of tension and suspense for the player. In this respect, Gothic tropes are less to do with narrative and maybe more to do with setting and atmosphere. Now, the issue of narrative and storytelling was a key point of discussion in the early days of video game scholarship. There was substantial debate concerning whether games told stories, what critical tools should be used to analyze the stories that games told, and whether academics should be talking about stories in the first place. One of the key issues concerning storytelling in video games relates to the problematic position of the player, who expects to have a participatory role in the story which is unfolding. If the player controls the character within the narrative, there is always the potential that they may not play the role in the manner that the story dictates. And in this respect, there is a clear tension between the interactivity of the video game apparatus and the fixed nature of traditional storytelling. And games designers have developed a range of strategies to overcome this issue. The most explicit is the use of cutscenes, a practice which draws upon the conventions of narrative cinema, where all interactivity ceases and the player is positioned as someone being told a story. In horror games, like many others, we also see non-interactive media elements less conspicuously integrated into the game environment. These might include journal entries, audio recordings, information on notice boards and computer screens, posters and newspaper articles scattered throughout the game space. Raccoon City in Resident Evil is littered with information which tells of the zombie apocalypse and the devastating events which followed. These non-interactive media artifacts serve the same function as cutscenes, insofar as they are elements embedded into the game space which provide narrative information. And one of the advantages they have over cutscenes is that players can often overlook such material if they are more interested in gameplay than in the story. Another key difference is that while cutscenes narrate the story taking place here and now in the game world, these media objects narrate a story from the past. And this brings us to the issue of time within video games. Again, we can consider the particular nature of video games as a medium compared to more traditional narrative formats. While novels tend to narrate events in the past tense, video games unfold in real time according to the inputs of the player. And I believe this is where the horror genre provides a particularly useful generic template for games designers. Horror and Gothic novels, films and television tend to revolve around characters uncovering information about events which happened a long time ago. The protagonists of these stories are literally and symbolically haunted by crimes which often happened before they were born. Similarly, the video game player is often positioned as a detective piecing together events which predate the start of the game. And the Silent Hill series provides an excellent example of this process. In the first game, Harry Mason is uncovering the history of the town, which involves a sinister cult, a mystical girl, and an attempted murder which destroyed part of the city. In Silent Hill 2, James is uncovering his own past, amnesia being a frequent trope of games, and it's notable that the main memory which he uncovers is found on a VHS cassette. In Silent Hill 3, Heather is uncovering her own history, and so forth. We have Silent Hill Origins, Silent Hill Shattered Memories, and Silent Hill Homecoming, all of which feature characters uncovering things which happened in the past. So at this point, I must provide a caveat to the approach that I'm taking in my analysis of these games. I do not claim to be a particular expert in Japanese culture, folklore, or horror, and so I'm approaching these stories largely from a Western perspective. Now, this is not necessarily a problem, as many of the games which I explore are aimed at an international audience. Both Silent Hill and also the early Resident Evil games are set in North America. Both franchises have been adapted into successful films and television programs, which feature Western characters and locations. And the influences on these series are significantly outside of Japan. Early Resident Evil games clearly draw upon George Romero's reimagining of the zombie as an animated corpse, while Silent Hill references the work of Stephen King, with numerous shout-outs to the author's books and film adaptations, alongside the lesser-known horror film Jacob's Ladder, a movie which inspired much of the game's iconography and ambiguous themes. So given these influences, it may not be inappropriate to explore these games in terms of Gothic tropes. In some respects, Silent Hill's Alessa shares various qualities with the telekinetic heroine of King's debut novel. Like Carrie, Alessa is raised by a single parent and religious zealot. At a certain age, she begins to develop mystical powers which disturb her mother and lead to her attempted infanticide. But while Carrie dies at the end of the book, Alessa lives on partly in a ghostly form that haunts the town in which she remains imprisoned. This narrative also has parallels with one of the most famous Japanese horror films, Ring, which also features a revengeful ghost of a young woman murdered by her parent. Visually, Alessa has little in common with the traditional folkloric female spirit, dressed in white with long black hair, but she clearly occupies a similar narrative position and symbolic resonance. What this might suggest is that these internationally successful horror franchises tap into anxieties and preoccupations which are more universal than culturally specific. Concerns about the past returning to contaminate the present, the oppressed returning to wreak revenge upon those who've oppressed them, children rebelling against an older generation who failed to take care of them. These concerns may exist across all nations and cultures. So I'd just like to conclude by going over some of the key themes which I've discussed in this presentation. I've considered narrative influences on horror video games, primarily from literature, but also from cinema. I've explored tensions between storytelling and interactivity and the various storytelling devices which games designers have developed in order to overcome those tensions. I've considered the problematic status of time within games, which tend to unfold in the present, whereas narratives traditionally take place in the past. And I've also considered the transnational themes and concerns that these games are maybe drawing upon. And I look forward to discussing some of these issues in the question and answer session which follows these presentations. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Dawn Stobbart and I am based at Lancaster University in the north of England. My research is primarily concerned with horror and the Gothic as it occurs across media, which includes film, television, literature, even podcasts, and of course video games. And I have a particular affinity with the survival horror game genre. Survival horror has a fascinating history, with influences ranging from the slasher film to Lovecraftian themes, with many other stops in between. I want to focus on the Lovecraftian and slasher influences on survival horror to consider how other media has influenced the genre. And this is going to be a bit of a whistle stop. So first, survival horror has some very deep roots in the slasher or stalker film, as it is also known. Carol Clover, in Her Body Himself, Gender in the Slasher film, which can be found in her 1993 book Men, Women and Chainsaws, summarises the slasher as the immensely generative story of a psycho killer who slashes to death a string of mostly female victims one by one until he himself is subdued or killed, usually by the one girl who was survived. Clover asserts that the killer stalks members of the young community. The killer kills members of the young community. The heroine sees the extent of the murders. The heroine sees the killer. The heroine does battle with the killer. The heroine kills or subdues the killer. The heroine survives, but the heroine is not free. It is not necessary for all these criteria to be met in order to identify an example of slasher fiction. Indeed, Clover herself, in citing Psycho as the first slasher film, provides a more open definition of the slasher genre, stating that the killer is the psychotic product of a sick family, but is still recognisably human. The victim is a beautiful, sexually active woman. The location is not home, at a terrible place. The weapon is something other than a gun. The attack is registered from the victim's point of view and comes with shocking suddenness. One striking example of a slasher video game is Clock Tower from 1995, a point-and-click game which fulfills much of the criteria of a slasher film. This particular game was known as one of the most sadistic games programmed for the Super Nintendo, and it's influenced directly by the 1985 film Phenomena, directed by Dario Argento and starring Jennifer Connelly as the protagonist, Jennifer Corvino. Phenomena was released in 1985 in Italy and then released to the rest of the world in 1986 with a new title, Creepers. This film was a direct inspiration for Clock Tower. There are many similarities, and indeed it's well known that the game's director wanted to create a game in Argento's style and used Phenomena as his narrative inspiration, particularly even as he was inspired by the entirety of Argento's filmography for the visuals. Now, the central character of both are Jennifer. They look similar, they act similar, and the film and game share many aspects of plot and tone, with the game tapping into the same kind of tensions as Phenomena, using the randomized attacks of antagonist the Scissorman to invoke the feeling of being trapped and the helplessness that Corvino feels as she tries to escape her Swiss boarding school in the film. The antagonists are equally similar, with both Patois in the film and Bobby in the game sharing the same facial abnormalities and both using a blade as their weapon of choice. And of course, there is the presence of the final girl. The final girl is a female presenting character who encounters the mutilated bodies of her friends and perceives the full extent of the preceding horror and of her own peril. She is chased, cornered and wounded, and we see her scream, stagger, fall, rise and scream again. This description of the final girl, as defined by Clover, perfectly describes the protagonist of Clock Tower. During the game, Jennifer embodies all the behaviours of the final girl, and these become her core attributes. As with most protagonists of this genre, Jennifer is not endowed with superhuman strength or weapons as she explores the mansion known as Clock Tower. In part, this is due to the point-and-click gameplay, which is not usually used for reflex-based actions such as fighting, but also serves to heighten our anxiety whilst playing. And this game, Matthew Weiss considers, allows the player to be the person they've mocked, shouting, "Don't go in there," watching films, as Jennifer and the player search for a means of escaping the monster, Barry Barrows, who is also known as the Scissor Man. The Scissor Man in Clock Tower perfectly fulfills the character type of the killer in the slasher genre, sharing all the major attributes with which Clover endows him, including a mask, a signature weapon, and a past drenched in familial dysfunction. His weapon is a pair of garden shear type scissors with long blades, and his family history contains membership of a demonic cult which leads to the birth of both Barry and his twin brother Dan, who, as the game implies, are also demonic creatures themselves. This information is discovered by the player through exploration of the mansion, and the mansion is itself a trope of the slasher film, the terrible place which Clover speaks of, and which author Stephen King calls the bad place in his book Danse Macabre. And he considers that the good horror story about the bad place whispers that we are not locking the world out, we are locking ourselves in with them. Now in Clock Tower, Jennifer and several other orphans are taken to the mansion after being adopted by Simon Barrows. The mansion is supposed to be a homely, welcoming place where the orphans can start a new life, but this is quickly subverted as Jennifer's friends are murdered early in the game. Whilst there are representational problems in classifying this as part of the slasher genre, which needs a lot more exploration, such as the fact it only explores the viewpoint of the final girl herself, meaning that most deaths take place off screen, the game offers the player an experience that attempts to invoke that of the character inside the narrative as an active participant, rather than presenting events as happening to somebody else that the viewer or the player just watches. Now, Clock Tower gives us a good insight into the beginnings of the relationship between film horror and video game horror, and how one can influence the other. But I want to go on to talk about one of my favourite video games and one of my favourite aspects of horror, and that is H.P. Lovecraft. The themes H.P. Lovecraft created for his horror fiction have found their way into all media, both explicitly through adaptation and also more subtly, where a Lovecraftian element may be alluded to, or even an aesthetic layer to a video game where we just see Lovecraftian elements. Lovecraft was a visionary writer whose art encompassed the entire universe and mediated on mankind's very small place in the overall scheme of things. And in his writings about horror, Lovecraft states that the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is that of the unknown. And this encapsulates Bloodborne. Now, in many horror narratives, tropes of Lovecraftian horror thrive. The monster, an important aspect of horror across the board, is as important to Lovecraftian tales as any other, with the Lovecraftian monster frequently forming the source of the horror. And this includes the realisation that there is more to the world, and indeed the universe, than we first thought. These monsters frequently threaten the borders of reality and are often the catalysts for a protagonist's mental decline. Lovecraft's cosmic horror uses the concept of secrets to carry narratives forward, secrets such as the existence of entities, Cthulhu, Shoggoth, and the Deep Ones, or the place of humans in the wider context of the universe, or even the presence of a forbidden book, such as the Necronomicon. A recurring pattern in Gothic fiction is the presence of the Frankensteinian plot, the intrusion into a natural order of the world. This leads to the creation of some monstrous abomination, resulting in the downfall of the creator. And this happens in Amnesia: The Dark Descent, for example. Gothic fiction, since its inception, has incorporated political anxieties related to social order and the individual, entwined with the return of the repressed and a fear of the other. And H.P. Lovecraft's short story talks about this very clearly. The Call of Cthulhu begins with the following lines. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of the black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. This incorporates the essence of a darker side of human ingenuity, reason and science bringing forth chaos rather than order, and this is what Bloodborne explicitly explores. Lovecraft's fiction is reminiscent of the insignificance of humankind in the grand scheme of the universe, and the potential forces or entities present in the vast unknown that are beyond conception and control of humans. The discovery of these entities and or forces in Lovecraft's fiction generally leads to an annihilation of reason, civilization, order, sanity, and the manifestation of a primal terror in the psyche. Bloodborne was released in 2015 and has an engaging combat, cryptic narrative and heavy environmental storytelling, and a high difficulty with a relatively steep learning curve. The game has used different types of enemies of differing strengths, offering a complex understanding of the monster, especially contextualizing the player as part of the monstrous lineage of those that must be killed. Earlier parts of the game, such as the streets of Yharnam, have monsters that are still very human, able to speak, and who denounce the player as a monster. As the game progresses, the beasts become less and less human, and are joined by the kin, who have evolved past that of the human. The game problematizes the concept of the monster in representing one that is cursed with the same plague as the protagonist, leading the player to question whether the real monster is in fact the protagonist or the Yarman inhabitants. Knowledge is similarly problematized. The humans that have evolved into the kin are presented as being monstrous, with their links to the great ones of the game being the source of their monstrosity. The protagonist is in part of this chain of being, interacting throughout the game with the kin, the centres of learning and the great ones, something that would qualify any other character as a monster. Here is a horror that is more than psychological. It goes beyond our very concepts of humanity and what it means to be human. As when playing Silent Hill, for example, Bloodborne forces us to explore where we've come from, where we may be going, both individually and as a species, and crucially, whether just because we can do something, should we do it? And that is the core of horror for me.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming. I'm going to be talking about the mechanics of horror. Thanks to the Japan Foundation of New York for having me. And a bit about me, my name is Richard Rouse. I'm a game director, designer, and writer. I've worked on a large number of different games, but most relevant to this talk, I was the director on the Suffering horror games. Later, I worked at Microsoft on the State of Decay franchise. And most recently, I shipped the horror-adjacent, sort of indie experimental game, The Church in the Darkness. I'm currently working on dark new games at Farbridge. So survival horror is a tricky term to apply to a whole genre because it was created as a marketing term for one specific game, 1996's Resident Evil. So in a way, determining if something is survival horror or not, or what the mechanics of survival horror are, is like saying, how much is this game like Resident Evil? So, but what are some of those mechanics that we talk about when you talk about survival horror? Well, let's look at a clip from the original Resident Evil and see what's in there. So here we see the game's famous fixed camera angle, where the player has to navigate their character sort of independently of where the camera is. They're going to use a lockpick here to try to get through this door. A lot of manipulating the inventory in this game. And then again, the character is often running towards the camera. The game will take advantage of this, like with this scene. This is the famous dog scene from the game, still known as one of the most scary moments in video games. And here the player has to use pretty difficult shooting controls to try to take down these dogs. And notice that they're able to get the action of the dogs attacking you into the extreme foreground because of the camera positioning. Because where the player was not necessarily close to the screen, they could put something right there, sort of between the player and the player character, which just makes for a very tense experience as you try to kill this zombie dog. Now, fortunately, this player is very smart. Maybe they've played the game before and they know that ammo is hidden under the furniture, and you can push and slide the furniture around to try to get your bullets back, because ammo scarcity is a big thing when playing Resident Evil. Now, as we saw in that clip, in Resident Evil, the player is often strapped for ammo, scrounging for resources. That next clip, they have to do a bunch of inventory management. The game is also difficult because of the controls and that fixed camera, and there's actually a technological reason why the camera was fixed like that. The rendering performance of the PlayStation 1 that Resident Evil originally came out on was not that powerful, so they reserved all of their sort of 3D rendering for the characters and pre-rendered those backgrounds. But if you have pre-rendered backgrounds, you have to have a fixed camera angle, because you can't just move wherever. So they sort of made a very pretty game, which I'm sure contributed to its success, and then also used this happenstance of having these fixed environments to create these very scary experiences, like spawning that dog in front of you, or other places where your player character is heading towards something that you as the player can't see. Can create a lot of very tense experiences, and the overall enemy lethality and the sort of obtuse puzzles you had to do while trying to survive these zombie attacks created a very tense and disturbing experience. Silent Hill is the other franchise most often associated with the term survival horror, and was built on a similar set of mechanics as Resident Evil. If anything, the characters in Silent Hill games were even weaker protagonists, with less access to resources. Even though its engine was fully 3D now, it still used those fixed camera angles for dramatic effect and to set the player up in pretty terrifying situations. It also had an emphasis on the same tricky puzzles and very limited inventory we saw in Resident Evil, but it made things even more scary by having genuinely twisted and disturbing enemies and dealing with pretty dark psychological themes. Some of its most disturbing parts, like the introduction of Pyramid Head in Silent Hill 2, for example, actually happened during a cutscene when the player has no control in the game at all. In the end, Silent Hill doubled down on the mechanics of Resident Evil and ended up making an arguably even scarier game. But now for a little contrast. A few years after those games, we started making The Suffering. And we set out to make a much more action-oriented experience to differentiate ourselves from those hit Japanese horror titles. We didn't like feeling weak as a protagonist in games. We wanted to make a game that empowered you to fight back against these horrific enemies. So let me show you a clip of some gameplay from The Suffering. So in this clip, you can see the camera is quite a bit different. It's now behind the character, which allows me to just aim at the enemies, and since it's a shooter game at its core, aiming is pretty important. And you can see I'm not really running out of bullets here either. I've got quite a few bullets. I'm actually dual wielding those two pistols, which allows me to take out these horrific creatures that keep spawning into the environment. And that is how we balanced it out. Like, yes, you are much more powerful as a character, you're able to take these out, but there are much more of them. They're coming at you from all directions. They can be overwhelming. But watching this, you can see sort of our core gameplay mechanics have a lot more to do with something like Max Payne than they do with Resident Evil. So clearly we were making something very different than Resident Evil. To make sure we were still making a horror game, we made our horror largely psychological, with disturbing threats tied to the haunted prison that the game was set in, as well as horrific events that were tied to the tragic past of the player character's own family. Here's an example.
Daddy! Help me, Daddy! It's so dark in here! What's going on, Daddy? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I won't do it again. Just let me out! Daddy!
Daddy, I can't see. Where are you? Turn on the lights. No, I don't want to see it. No! Daddy, no!
We achieved our most disturbing elements by integrating them with the gameplay, as you saw in that clip, where the player still had control and was still playing. They were just put into a slow-mo state, and we like doing that instead of just putting them to cutscenes where players always feel a little bit safe because they know they won't die during a cutscene. So interestingly, when the game came out, some of the press debated, like, is this an action horror game or is this a survival horror game? Some saw this as something of great discussion to be debated, but some just got on with playing the game and admitted it was definitely still a horror game. So Resident Evil 4 moved away from the survival horror formula to be much more action horror. Camera controls were much more in line with the growing third-person shooter conventions. You couldn't move and shoot, and you still had to manage your inventory, but it was much closer to a shooter than any of the previous games. But as Resident Evil moved farther away from survival horror mechanics, other game developers still wanted to make horror games with very weak protagonists. But now those games can be made by indie developers and sold digitally. The Amnesia and Outlast series are great examples of this. The franchises definitely felt more like survival horror again, through the weakness of their protagonists and the extreme scarcity of resources. There aren't any guns even to be found in either of these games. You often just have to run from the horrific threats. But the other switch these games did was to change the perspective to first person. They couldn't get away with the camera tricks that something like Resident Evil or Silent Hill would use to scare you, but instead they placed the character right in the middle of the action. They couldn't hide behind a third person character avatar anymore. And ultimately, these are very terrifying games. Resident Evil seemed to learn a lot from these games as well, and indeed when Resident Evil 7 came out, it too had shifted to first person. You don't even have a gun for the first several hours of the game. Resident Evil felt like survival horror once again. But there's one other genre that I think has some of its roots in survival horror, and that's what's just called survival games now. From DayZ to State of Decay to The Forest, these are all games with strong horror themes, with game mechanics built around resource scarcity and where inventory management is crucial. But also permadeath has been added, which makes playing these games an extremely tense experience for players, knowing that they can lose all of their progress if they take one wrong step. These games focus less on the type of fixed stories found in Resident Evil or Silent Hill, and instead these survival games have story worlds, where players will play them over and over again and ultimately create their own stories. So that's a little picture of how horror games have evolved since the term survival horror was first used. If you look out in the games world today, you'll find that to most players, the term survival horror is pretty much synonymous with just horror games. And maybe that's just fine. Lots of mechanics can create a horror experience. It's all just a matter of taste, what you in particular find the most compelling to play, while still being scary.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the live part of our event tonight. Let me start to thank Sean and the Japan Foundation from New York to organize this session. We are very happy to talk about survival horror. Thank you to Dawn, to Ewan, to Richard to be part of this surviving night on the Friday the 13th. So just in case, I prepare myself, and then if you just survival book, in case something will happen, and then this one is really good for in the worst case scenario. So in case something happening around you tonight during the event, just jump back, and then we'll be able to work on that. So I'm very happy. As for this, those different episodes in this great series, we did have a number of questions from people during the week. We put it in different teams, then we're gonna address during the next hour and a half. Thanks to everyone for doing that. And then again, as Sean said, don't forget to ask questions in the chat for the event. We're gonna answer those questions later. Again, so I might not be doing something that people didn't do in the other episode of this this series. I'm going to flash things around. So I love books. So I have books there about horror. I have a bunch of games. So we can, if we think about the game, I'm going to show it to you. And again, I'm going to start again. So that's Ewan's book, Video Game in the Gothic. Then we have Dawn book, video games and horror, from Amnesia to a Zombie Run. Great cover. And do not forget, so we have Richard with us, but Richard, this great book, I have the first edition, but game design theory and practice. And then I did my book on the world of scary video games. So, and I'm using that just to get, there's an elephant in the place. Compared to other episodes of this series, we are specialists of survival horror and the horror genre, but I do think that we are specialists of Japanese culture. And at one point, you know, when Sean asked me to do that, to chair the session, I was surprised because for me, survival is Japanese, but I never really thought about saying that in the Japanese perspective. So we're going to work a bit on that. But at one point, we're there to really talk about this notion of survival horror and what the horror genre is. And I think that Richard did really end up this presentation pretty well to open up to other vision that, you know, everything is not survival horror. That's what I wanted to say in my presentation too. So let's start. We had a great question by Amber from Salisbury. It's ice breaking, so it's great. So she asked us, what is your favorite survival horror game? So let's start. Down.
Oh, that's quite difficult. There's so many great survival horror games, but I do like the classics, so Silent Hills and Fatal Frame. And one of my particular great horror games, as I mentioned in my thing, is Bloodborne. I think Bloodborne, while it has a really steep learning curve and you've got to do a lot of fighting, as a survival horror game, I think it's brilliant. It's got the atmosphere, the psychology, all the things I have as ticks for my likes.
Great. You won?
Okay, well,
it sounds hard. When we know your work, when
yes,
you know your work, it's not very hard.
Huge fan of Silent Hill, yeah, and I would struggle to choose which is my favorite. Probably is Silent Hill 3. I just really like Heather as a character. I think the environments are really detailed. The funfair that isn't particularly fun is a great location. But if I was going to think a little bit outside the box, I'd probably say Eternal Darkness. Slightly less known title. It's very Lovecraftian, as Dawn mentioned, the influence of Lovecraft on survival horror. It's got very interesting hub structure, lots of different characters from different historical periods, all of which contribute to the central narrative. And also it has that insanity effect, which has been written about quite extensively. So yeah, I'd say Eternal Darkness, Santi's Requiem.
Great. Richard, so Richard, it's nice that there's some choices that you're making that are not typical, so that's great.
Yeah, I saw when we were comparing notes before the session that everyone had picked Silent Hill already. If I were to pick my favorite sort of classical survival horror game from the glory years, Silent Hill 2 would be the one. But some other games that you wouldn't fit the strict definition of survival horror, like BioShock, I think is a great game across the board that has more scary elements in it than you might think. A couple of recent indie games, what is indie exactly, but Phasmophobia online multiplayer ghost hunting thing has a lot of the elements of survival horror in that it's resource management and you're very weak protagonist and can be killed quite quickly in that, but it's also very different because it's multiplayer, really experience built for multiplayer. Another indie game I've been liking that fits horror but not in the scary way would be like Dredge. Is the sort of like really ominous mood to that cute little indie game. And I'm actually looking forward to getting back to Redfall right now. They just released a patch for it, and that was a game I was actually enjoying. And that's, a looter shooter, but it's set in a scary environment. There are sort of horror elements and the odd scare here and there in it. So yeah, quite a few different things under the horror umbrella there.
Right, and for me, I'm classical, but there's Silent Hill 2. Fatal Frame 2 is amazing, so we cannot not get away from that. And after that, if we go to scary games, Amnesia, Outlast, are the few games now that are on the top of my list. So we break the ice with our games. Let's go to the questions. So we put that in teams, and then you'll see it's falling pretty well. So thank you for everyone for this. The first thing will be, and then it's the question of today, the difference between Japanese and Occidental or Western a game. Gabrielle in Chile was asking, according to you, what are the main difference between Japanese and Occidental approach? Marta was talking, Marta from UK was talking about the difference between psychological and physical horror. And I do think that with the suffering, Richard, you just mix those things together, which are really nice. Or they're opposed or they're together. And then again, Roberto from Brazil was asking something interesting. What is the difference? There's a line between survival horror and psychological horror. So see, we already see that, when talking about the genre, there's a mix. We're stuck now with the label survival horror that came in 96 with Resident Evil. Then, like I showed in my talk, we're going back in history, and then with Christian games that didn't know what they were survival horror, but they became survival horror. And after that, things open up. So, and then just to start the mix of those things. So in my talk, I was talking about transnationality. In the episode 16 of this series about how Japanese folklore and its monster shape modern horror, Mike Randall was talking about G horror, and then as we are trying to find the specificity of G horror, and he said something great. He said G horror was a great hybrid form made for global audiences. And when we think about survival horror, about Resident Evil, I do have that in mind. And at one point, like I said, I wrote a book about the old scary games without really going for the specificity of the people that were making it, because we're going for the emotion that. But there's still, there's we can see Silent Hill, Resident Evil, Fatal Frame. There's still something that are linked to the Japanese-ness of the people that made it. So, Don, do you have you want to start?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest differences is adrenaline. So in a lot of Western games, it's big guns, lots of ammo, and go in there and shoot. And that's completely the opposite, I feel, with survival horror and a lot of Japanese survival horror games, especially. It's about the atmosphere and the feelings rather than running in there with a big gun and unlimited amount of ammo.
Anyone?
Yeah, I think there's maybe something to be said about the kind of aesthetics. There is a kind of subtle difference between the visual design of American horror games and a game like Fatal Frame or Forbidden Siren. When you play those games, there is something unmistakably Japanese, it seems, about the aesthetic, and it's not just to do with the characters. It's to do with the environments, and even just like the texture of those games seems to be very specifically located in a Japanese tradition. But it is really quite a complicated one. I mean, I'm sort of replaying the Devil May Cry series at the moment, and visually these games are all set in kind of these big sort of sprawling sort of Gothic European environments that don't really seem to be making that much connection with Japanese culture. And yet at the same time, there is something about the over the topness of the game. There's something like Dante that does seem to reflect certain tropes of Japanese culture. But it is also interesting that two of the main survival horror franchises, Resident Evil and Silent Hill, both are explicitly set in North American locations. I think that notion of transnationality is a really interesting way of unpicking the different elements that are at work within those games.
Right, Richard, since you're the American designer that I played Resident Evil and Silent Hill, and then you were talking about adding some psychological aspect to the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So were you at a turn inspired by Japanese games, and have you looked at them as the Japanese developer or having an impact on me, or was it like just by playing the games and?
Yeah, no, before we even started on the suffering, we had played Silent Hill 2 in particular and liked that a lot, and just thought and we wanting to make a horror game of some kind. We were inspired by that, but then also thinking, but we also like a game like Half-Life, right? And Half-Life, like if you go back to the origin of that, I believe interviews with someone from there, possibly Gabe Newell, said that they were inspired by taking Resident Evil elements and putting them into a shooter environment to, obviously Half-Life at that time was revolutionary for like how much narrative it had and how it was, that narrative was integrated into the gameplay and wasn't just told through cutscenes. And so, we saw that game, but we didn't really see that game as a horror game. So we said, what if we took the elements we like of something like Half-Life and added more horror to it again to get it to clearly be a horror game? And so we sort of took the mechanics of something like Half-Life or something like Max Payne, which actually came out after we started, but was very inspirational sort of in the middle of development, but then brought in the horror element. So, though you were talking before, Ewan, about the sort of aesthetics of the enemies and for the suffering, we tried to have a very unique aesthetic to them, which was based on some of our concept artists and stuff and their very specific art style, instead of trying to do the American style, which I know what you mean when you say that. But Silent Hill was a big inspiration for that. So we were taking some of that sort of really twisted characters and just really, odd sort of bondage things going on and thinking, how could we put that into our creatures, which are going to play very differently because it's more of a shooter game, because we, again, we wanted to create that little bit more of a power fantasy to the experience. That was very explicit, but bring in the horror. So definitely inspired by Japanese, but definitely also acknowledging that we were going to be different than them.
Yeah. But and that's for me, so there's the survival horror and the survival terror. But I was looking, that's the book that I was quoting by Marak, and she says something that really speak to me in the way that we see the difference between American and Japanese horror. So she said Japanese horror narrative poses the horror element as something that needs to be explained, whereas American horror presented as an obstacle to be acknowledged and overcome. And I do think that the adventure that we go on. When we go to Resident Evil, so you have to find, the virus, and then you fight the zombie, and then all the T-virus monster. As we go in Silent Hill or in Fatal Frame, you want to explain what's happening to you, and going in the village, as for Fatal Frame 2, and in Silent Hill. So there's something that, the real difference come from the relation to the realm of the spirit. I know that Shintoism is, people stay with us. There's a notion of hell and heaven is not as important. So there's the possibility to have those two connections. So it's not about, is it possible? So why this has happened and how can we understand it? And again, if we go back to the ghost story and then the Uri, and then there's all those theme of the redemption, the guilt. Silent Hill is all about redemption and guilt, as Resident Evil is all about, fighting and then, good and evil. And I do think that at one point, when we get to those relationship to ghost stories, and then it's more about the people, it's more about understanding the strange, in the Kaidan stories, the tale of the strange. And that's for me, when I think about it and I look it back, that's what brings this notion of, psychological aspect, which is really much more present in the game, that want to, at one point, have going more on the spectrum of the Japanese-ness than a game like Resident Evil, or even like when you were talking about Hunting Ground, which is pretty gothic. So again, so there's a mix there between, the trying to understand what's happening and all the gothic that's coming. You want to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Haunting Ground is
Hello,
one of those
everyone.
really peculiar
Welcome to
games. I mean,
episode
it was
18
I
of
think
Japan
it was going to be
Foundation's Pop Culture
originally
series.
part of the
My name is Sean Inouye with the
Clock Tower series. So I think it connects with some of the things that Dawn was saying. But yeah, that is a game which, it has all those kind of like slasher movie elements. You've got a female protagonist who's trying to escape from various adversaries, but it is also set in this very clearly in this kind of Gothic mansion. And there are just from my work, there seem to be some very clear, almost explicit references to traditional Gothic, particular specific Gothic texts going on in that Gothic works of Gothic literature. And it's, I mean, the position of but also it shows the way in which all these genres are drawing upon each other. So the slasher movie was drawing upon the gothic. So it doesn't necessarily it doesn't seem so strange that then you've got a kind of almost like a reverse where Clock Tower moves from being slasher back into gothic and finds that exactly the same tropes of the kind of imperiled heroine trying to escape from various kind of adversaries works just as well. I think it shows that the kind of international games industry and the way in which the international influences that all horror artists are maybe subjected to.
Yeah, because for us, the first time that you get into Fatal Frame, at one point, so we get to the angry ghost, but all the ghosts are not angry. So not all the ghosts are coming to us. They're suffering, and then there's something that's very important there. So there's this notion of victim of horror, victim of atrocity, and it's trying to find a way to get the burden of this vengeful emotion then they went through and then stick with us, which is not the same kind of monstrosity that we have in Western games, where it's much more about big monster, different monster. And again, I'm thinking about the suffering with all those weird design that were based on how people were killed. So there's something there. Again, just a quick question. Adriana from Brazil was asking if we played Siren, Forbidden Siren, and how we liked it. Maybe that's it's a nice switch because that's zombie, but it's zombie, not ghost. So have you played it? And now, what is your take about this game, which is somewhere there? Siren here. So I showed it. Have you played it, Ewan and Richard?
Yeah, I didn't get very far with it though. I found it it's very punishing.
Yeah, it's a dark game. It's a really dark game.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the main things I thought was interesting about it is the way that it plays with ideas of vision. And in horror cinema, there's always this theme. I think Carol Clover, who Dawn mentioned, also talks about this. The themes of the monster seeing things through the perspective of the monster's eyes. And it is a game which really plays around with vision and optical perspective in a really interesting way.
And this notion of anticipation, so you can hijack yourself in the Shibito, but you have to learn what they're going to do. So you're putting in, they're playing on the part of the monster and part of the victim. So you have to learn all those people is going to go around the village and to be able to get away. So there's a lot of time of waiting in Siren that I learned, which is far away from action that we normally have. And at one point, it's all about you thinking, what can happen, what can I do, making your strategy to be able to get away. So again, we're in this notion of psychological aspect. And let me come back, because let's go back to the question that Marta was saying, though. So how do you think the physical versus the psychological and the physical horror, where's the difference? And then Richard, that was very interesting, because for you, if you play the suffering, it's very action games, but at the same time, and then we're gonna come back to that later with a notion of sound, which is very important. But can we make this distinction between physical, very gory horror, and then psychological, and then game can mix the two and then work on the two?
Yeah, no, we definitely were thinking of that while working on the game, and thinking like, well, we are giving the player all of this, all this weaponry and stuff. So how is this going to be scary if the player is feeling powerful all the time? And when comparing ourselves with the hit Japanese games, we were thinking we're not going to do that. And there was certainly concerns like, how can it be as scary? And I just thought of like, well, how are and like the advantage that us, like a Resident Evil in particular, had with control of the camera and exactly where you're looking and stuff. And we don't want to do that, because we want the player to be in control of the camera and be able to look wherever they want to look. So I remember thinking, well, how do horror novels do it, right? They control absolutely where you're going, but they can't do jump scares in the same way. And you're not immersed like you are if you go into a cinema or something and are watching a movie that's coming at you, or a video game where you can't control the camera. And it's like, well, a horror novel often relies more on the psychological horror. So that was where the like core gameplay of the shooter isn't so much the horror part, but these narrative events happening around it, which we tried to still make interactive, as I was mentioning in my earlier thing, of just how do we keep the player experiencing these narrative things, but also thinking they could be killed at any time. Well, we can't put them as cutscenes quite as much, just to keep that sort of, so it's like a combination of psychological horror with a little fear of I might be killed as well. So a little bit of a mix, but definitely, going on that psychological horror side.
Don, you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just thinking about psychological horror and how video games make us feel. So the idea that maybe there might be something around that next dark corner, rather than we're going to go barreling into it and we're going to try and kill it. We've got to be careful because we need to survive. And I think that's quite a big difference in some games, isn't it?
But at one point, the horror genre is psychological in itself.
Yeah.
Because it's, it's the point of being scared, it's the point to be horrified. So at one point, if we do play the game, because, we can go for a novel, we can go for cinema, the genre is already interactive. They're playing with you. There's the anticipation, and again, Richard, again, we're going to come back to that later. The notion of is a novel can be scary. If you're into it and then you're reading and then you're expecting something bad, you're scared. So you can jump to it. So again, that's the good thing with this notion of horror, terror, and fear. There's the mix of something going on with some games that do choose to be, let's say, more action, so horror will be more there, and games that really try to stick to this notion of everything's happening in the head of the gamer, the spectator, or the reader. If we learn that, and I do think that Richard is putting that up front, we're okay. Okay, so just before to go to the next team, so we get a question from Haru Him from South Korea. That's this big question: what is the philosophy behind survival horror? And Ewan, I do think you have a great take on that.
Yeah, I think I in the document that we were circulating, I made a typical sort of academic observation. There's lots of different things that scare us. There's probably multiple philosophies of horror, but the one I find most compelling is the idea of the uncanny, which I think is something that runs through a lot of horror game design, and it's a very, very fascinating, quite complex term. Freud wrote a very famous paper trying to unpick what the uncanny is, and it's like something. I think it ties in with discussions about horror and psychological and more kind of like gross out horror. I mean, the uncanny is something that unsettles us, which makes us feel without necessary, but also something that's quite compelling. Like we enjoy the kind of frisson that uncanny produces, and it's sort of associated with things like dolls and mannequins and things that look human but aren't, things that are moving and as if they're alive, but we know they're not really. And I think a lot of horror games draw upon this in their monster design and in the way the creatures move. I think the designer of Five Nights at Freddy's does a really good job in mobilizing the kind of like the uncanny in the very robotic movements of the various kind of like adversaries in that game. And of course that fits very well with video games as a medium, because video games are something that is looking like it's alive but it really isn't. And if video games, if they're glitchy or if they fail in some way, they do already produce a sense of the uncanny. So I think if we're talking about games and horror games, I think that the philosophy of the uncanny is probably the most useful one to help us unpick some of these processes.
Right. And for me, I cannot not refer to The Philosophy of Horror by Noel Carroll.
Yep.
I do think that's a book, at least for the scholar, it's something that is very inspiring for us, because video game is just pushing what literature and cinema has done, make us reflect about the paradox of fiction. How can we be scared about something that we do believe does not exist? And then Carroll has this, this notion of a thought story. So because again, psychological, we're putting ourselves in the shoes of the character we can be afraid. How again the usefulness of being scared to learn about our world, to learn about our human human nature. So survival horror, a scary game, or just pushing the philosophy of horror, of the appeal. And the good thing in this book, Carol is talking about, is pushing a theory that he put in front, and that's going to be nice for the narration afterwards. The erotic narration. So a plot is always working on answering question. You have a question, then you answer a question, and that's really good for gameplay, and it's very good for horror. So again, philosophy of horror, if you want to look at that, there's a lot of answers to your question here. Okay, so let's go to another team that Don just start to put that together for us, the relationship between video games and other media, and especially film. So Rose from California asked, is there an overlap between video games and film? Annie from UK did ask, is there a difference between survival horror games and different medium, literature, cinema, and television, which is pretty nice because, film is pretty short now with those horror. And then, I'm going to do tonight, so the fall of the Usher House by Flanagan. So again, there's something interesting. So what are the overlap, the difference, or the link between cinema and video games? Now, maybe you want to extend your talk and then start to open up.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest differences between video games and other media is the idea of narrative distance. So this is what I think is how far away from the character you are either viewing, playing, or reading about. And I think in video games, we're a lot closer to the character we're playing. So we get to walk a mile in their shoes. And that doesn't happen very often in other media, I don't think. I think it's an amazing thing that we can do playing video games, creating video games to lessen that narrative distance, to allow us to walk in somebody else's shoes. And I think that's one of the biggest differences between video games and most other media.
And Richard, do you want to jump? Because you really talked about, fixed camera and the control of the camera, and then
and the difference too, as the games shifted from the most popular games being third person to being first person, I think there's a lot that could be discussed about how that changes your identification with the character. You're not seeing the character anymore, but you are like the character more or less. I think there's a lot of sort of debate still within games, like which is better for storytelling or and which is better for horror. We saw that the Resident Evil team decided to go first person, which was very surprising to me at the time, given the history of the franchise, but I think very successful. I really liked Resident Evil 7 quite a bit. And I do think, when we talk about the overlap with what is the overlap with cinema, which I think was, where we started on this, I'm always thinking of, there's a lot of things you can do in cinema that you can't really do very well in games. And a lot of times game developers will get in trouble trying to do something that feels more cinematic, where you're playing a very fixed character that you don't have a role in creating their story in the game, where you're just being led on this thing and then you're doing the puzzle and then more story happens or something, instead of having enough space in the story for the player to express themselves, make just different tactical decisions in combat, or sometimes different choices in the narrative, and just creating a story that feels like there's space for the player to be in it, to go in there and create the final narrative for the game, is the part that when the player has played it. Other media can more exist on its own, but a game only exists with the player.
Yeah, and then if we talk about visual media, off-screen space is very important. You can be in the first-person perspective, you can be in the third-person perspective with the camera behind your shoulder. You can have fixed camera angles. Everything is about what you see in that frame, which VR is changing a bit, and the notion of sound. So I do think that one of the elements that video game learned a lot, our video game learned a lot, or scary video game from cinema, is the notion of sound, and then we cannot get away from that. And then I don't know if you want to touch a bit, or I'm going to make this transition. You want to add something?
On the theme of sound. Well, I mean, the thing that immediately jumps to mind is the radio, static radio in Silent Hill, and how that acts almost like a kind of Geiger counter to tell you when you're about to encounter something in this kind of mist-filled environment. I mean, it's quite a. I mean, it's a fantastic device. And it really shows the way in which sound travels in a way that light doesn't, so you can hear things that you can't see, and it just produces this amazing sense of discomfort, as well as also acting as a really useful gameplay mechanic in terms of sort of flagging up what you're about to see. So it's sort of like when you're watching a suspense movie and you can hear the violins building up, you know something's about to happen, rather than a jump scare which kind of seems to come out of nowhere.
Yeah. So here we're gonna make a nice transition with that game, Alien Isolation. Because if we think about overlapping between film and video games, the notion of transmedia now is very important. So have you all played you probably all played this amazing game. And at one point, this notion, so we're ready, we know what we're gonna have to go through, and then we really go through it. The xenomorph is going after us. Because the other question that we had, the next theme that we had, is based on the question of immersion and atmosphere. So Geoffrey from New York was asking, how much should a game immerse the player in the horror game? Then what do you think about the concept of setting, the space as a character? So Silent Hill, Raccoon City. And then Ekal from Indonesia was asking, how do you build a good horror, scary atmosphere? So again, here, if we make the switch with the sound and the specificity of video games, we got, this setting. And then the sound, where are we going to hide? Is it coming to us? Where is it coming? And I'll be alive in the next 5 minutes. So game immersion, the importance of the setting, of the atmosphere.
One of the great things I thought from Alien Isolation is how the microphone on your control pad lets the xenomorph hear you. And so you might be hiding under a hospital trolley, you might be in the locker, but if it hears noise coming from your microphone in your control pad, it comes looking for you. So that gives you a double layer of, not only do you have to be quiet in the game world, you have to be quiet in the real world too, and that really heightens the tension when you're playing. Somebody comes in and shouts when you're in a bad place.
Yeah. Notion of setting, Iwan, you had a really good point in the document that we prepare. So
yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure some of the people following this will be familiar with the idea of the way in which games designers embed narrative within spaces. So often when you're exploring a space like the underwater city in BioShock's a really good example of this. There's this kind of environmental storytelling going on where the space reveals information about what's happened in the past. Like the presence of placards or posters, or even just sort of ruined spaces or graffiti scrawled on walls. And I think it's really interesting that whole position of space within horror. I think in the talk, I think it was Dawn's talk, mentioned both Stephen King and Clover talking about the kind of bad place or the terrible place. And I think if horror is all about spaces, it's often about spaces, haunted spaces or monstrous spaces, then and games are about exploring spaces, that might be one of the reasons why horror works really well with the video game medium.
And Richard, you had, I'm going to let you say what you said, because it's perfect.
I mean, I think of all the things, if you're setting out to make a horror video game, I think setting is almost your most important decision. And it's also just in terms of, we found when I've been involved in like user research studies of like how players absorb narrative in games, they definitely remember the setting for sure. Like it's the thing that connects with them the most. They might also connect with characters, but they can almost never remember the plot. Like what happens, what the ending is, what happened 2 hours ago, it's all gone because they're sort of living in the moment of this game. And they might have a character. And when I say character too, I mean a character who's actually in the game with you, not like that just shows up in cutscenes or something. And so having that setting, really becoming a character in itself and being in this place like Rapture and BioShock, or lots of other great examples from games of just, being in like the city in Cyberpunk or something like that. It just feels like it has all this, it's a place you want to go. Even if it's like a disturbing place to go, right? Even if it's like a scary place to go, it's like a place to go, and the players are going to connect to that so much more than any element of your narrative that you really have to nail it. And that was something definitely with The Suffering, where we set it in a haunted prison. That was like, well, this is a place you don't really want to go already, but you're kind of fascinated about. So you kind of want to go there in the context of a game. It's sort of a perfect, safe way to experience this, and then a great place to have, to up the ante and sort of the terrible things that are happening there.
Yeah. Well, sorry. So it's in French, but the title is called Even of Fear. So it's one of my friends that wrote this recent book on scary video games. And he's saying that, horror is all about places. But the problem that we have is those places are terribly various organism. So the place wants to eat us. And that's what make it really, really scary. And I was reading, I do think that's for the remake of the new Dead Space. One of the reviewers saying that, a good horror story is as good as his haunted house. So it depends of your setting. If your setting is scary, there's something different. Then we're talking just before we got it live about the Castillo Protocol, which came out just before the remake of Dead Space. And for me, the space was brown, as Richard was saying, but it was not as habitated by sound and then, lively organism as Dead Space is, and the remake still is. So the notion of setting is so important. And then we do recall Raccoon City, Silent Hill. In my mind, I do recall, when Fatal Frame, the village, some level design, that you're going up on a corridor and the camera change, and then the ghost going to come. The fixed camera angle for Resident Evil were based on the fact that, you get to build your Spencer mentioned and how you create your space to hide zombie. So setting is very, 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 very important. So I do think, like we're saying, it's the bottom line of a good horror story is where does it happen? In any video game, it has to be put in an environment that's going to be really live. And then let's think, Silent Hill is lively, when it's moving, and then there's something that has to be worked around. Atmosphere. So setting is about atmosphere too, the notion of mood. I do think that then, and we get again, so those teams gonna come together with technical limitation, but the darkness, the fog in Silent Hill, the sound for the mood, and if we look at that from an emotional part. In French, we talk about atmosphere and we talk about humeur. In English, we get the mood, which is, the atmosphere, and at the same time, the reaction that we have. And the good thing with video games, they're putting in, when you're in a terrified mood, you're going to stay there. You're going to stay in this emotion for a long time, compared to cinema or even compared to TV, which is, there's more of this up and down. You cannot. But in video games, when you're afraid of going in front of you, the atmosphere is, the mood is really in your, really stuck with you. I recall when I played, Fatal Frame, my hands were wet, and it's one of the best feeling. You just, that's scary game for me. So just atmosphere. So we talked about setting, but the notion of atmosphere, for example, just Richard, we're going to go back to you as your designer, but State of Decay, which were in open space too, in the prison for the Suffering. How did you work, for instance, your atmosphere for the Suffering, which the place is already put with all the danger that we can have in a prison, and at the same time you have to keep your gamer on his toe, on her toe.
Yeah, well, I mean, it turned out the prison is a great place to set a video game because all the doors are locked ahead of time. It's an explanation. Usually when you're playing like an open world game and you're like, why can't I go in this building? Why can't I? Yes, there's a great explanation for that in a prison setting. And we really tried to get something that looked as much like a prison as like a real world prison. Because often, I find sometimes you can go either in video games or TV shows, films, if you've actually been to the place it's set, you're like, a police station doesn't look like that or whatever, right? It's just been made up a thing. But we really said, well, we did like a lot of research and ton of just like, how can we make this really feel like the real world place? Because a real prison is like very like cheap materials and just concrete everywhere and just garish paint and stuff like that. And like, how can we put all of those things to our game so it kind of looks ugly like the real thing, but kind of beautiful in that ugly at the same time. So that was a lot of sort of creating that setting that feels like the real place. And I would say State of Decay, which I wasn't there at the start of that project, and I sort of worked with the team that did that for a year, but they really wanted to create a place that felt like a real Americana type of town, has a lot of elements of like real signs that aren't the actual brand names of things, but have that feeling of like sort of a North Pacific Northwest perhaps town is sort of the vibe of where it is. And it helped that the team that made that was in that location, was able to pull from those elements. And it really, even though that's much less of a scary game, I think, than a lot of the ones we're talking about, it does have that real sense of place, that you're in somewhere that feels like the real place, and then it's overrun with zombies. So that makes it a little more unsettling.
Yeah, so the sense of place too. So we're the notion of immersion. You can be in the third-person perspective game and be immersed as you can be in the first-person perspective game. I do feel as in the space of the Spencer mentioned and the Baker house in Resident Evil 7. So this notion of immersion. But again, just to move on, we have a great question for William from Japan. But it's in some way, survival horror games maintain player immersion. But he was asking, what about the video gaming elements like inventory screen, save station? We're in a game. We know we're in a game. We're supposed to be immersed, but at the same time, we have the interface, and we have elements that are saying this is a game. So how this is included or being part of the frightening or a scary experience? Do you want to?
Yeah, I think it's one of those strange paradoxes, isn't it? That games can sort of become quite scary when they actually kind of acknowledge the position of the player. I mean, there are some of my favorite scary moments are bits where the moments where the fourth wall is broken. There's a moment where in Silent Hill 3 where Heather turns to the player and berates them for one of the things they're trying to get her to do. And there's also a bit in if anyone's played Silent Hill Shattered Memories, there's this moment where the Wiimote becomes like a mobile phone that starts to ring, and then you put it to your ear and you hear somebody talking to you. And I didn't even realize that there was a microphone or that was something that the Wiimote could do. And it really feels like the game is intruding into the space. I did play a really interesting game. Has anyone played Signalis? Which is which is really interesting, because that's a game which is clearly aesthetically taking all its cues from sort of PlayStation 1 games in terms of its quite blocky design, and it oddly does have a kind of slightly eerie quality to it, in the same way as like black and white films seem a bit more like horror, because they're kind of, there's something about that kind of old media that is a little bit creepy and a little bit unsettling. So I think there's the person who asked that question is really touching on something quite interesting, paradoxical in the way that games function.
Yeah, and for me, the example that I was to answer this question is I'm as relieved to find a safe point that I am relieved to find a locker to hide myself in Outlast. So I know that I play a game. I know the safe point is saving me, and I know that if I hide myself pretty well in the universe of the game, I'm going to be okay for a while if the monster is not coming to me. So there's always this oscillation between I know that I play a game, I'm in the game, and all those elements are part of the experience. And we know sometimes we get an inventory screen, the game stops. And in some other games, when you go to an inventory screen, the game does not stop. So you cannot just move things around. You have to really quick to be able to change and be able to go back in your games and fight your monster. So I see the time is running. So just to fast forward back. fast forward in our question. We're going to mix two. So we had question about narrative and question about character. So how do we make a good horror plot? How the narration is coming, and how this notion of character is built. So we're talking about setting the characterization of the space, but at one point we also have to talk about the characterization of the people that we're playing, the people that we are living through. So narrative and character, how do horror game play with that? Don, you want to start?
I was thinking about what was I thinking about? My brain has just blanked there. Can Richard?
Sure.
And I'll come back. Is that all right?
Yeah.
You know, when you start off and
It's late in your place.
Good.
We know. Sorry.
it's the real world terror. So the thing I think about, with how do you set up a scary place, a scary game with a scary plot specifically? Again, I said earlier that plot is sort of the least important part of a game story to me. It's more those characters and the settings, and the characters, I want them to be, on par with the player. So it feels like they don't know the player character often doesn't know what's going on in the world and what the things are. And I like the characters to also be sort of confused about it while also dealing with, their own problems. And that again brings back the psychological horrors, like past traumas or past events, that can be layered into these characters. And that when you still need to make a plot, even though it's the least important part. You still want the players who do get to the end feel satisfied and get there. And hopefully you can take these characters with their different traumas that relate to what's going on in the thing and take them somewhere interesting with those, either good or bad. Not everyone needs to have a happy ending in a horror game. That's part of why I like horrors. Not always happy endings. And so you get the plot itself is often tricky to be scary, but having them go on that way and then seeing that things don't always work out, I think is a key to keeping it terrifying.
Excellent. That is basically what I was thinking about in Spec Ops: The Line, which is horror adjacent. I think there's a lot of horrific elements, and the character is fully formed and fully fledged as you get Martin. Martin his name, and you don't have the room to put yourself into his character, so it makes a complete difference.
Yeah, but again, there's the classical opposition between the ordinary character, because Emily from UK was memorable character like James in Silent Hill and Miles in Outlast. So there's the frail ordinary character that are facing the horror, and there's the super soldier, the trained people of the Resident Evil light that are bring up there. And then again, this characterization bring us the opposition between first-person shooter and first-person avoider. So horror or terror is going now. Outlast is about no guns. Then you got to run around. So at one point, this notion of characterization, choosing to not give, this masculine military option to the gamer, just change something. And then if we go back to Resident Evil or even in Alone in the Dark, I don't recall the number, but I do think that there's not many ammunition in the Alone in the Dark, the first game in '92. So every shot count. But then we know that some games they're going to give you or take out some ammunition if they want you to be too powerful, and it's all based also on this notion of character. How do you give to your character? And then again, if you take the suffering, if you give this badass guy, well, the monster and the danger has to be bigger, because at one point this person can transform itself in monster, so there's something there. So we see how the narrative and the characterization is mixing together. I'm going to go because I see time is running. But so sorry for the people that we didn't answer those great questions. We could be here until 2:00 at night in UK, and then stay for a long time. But there's a last question that's very interesting, and then it opening up, and then it maybe wrap up this notion of survival scary game. So Amber was also asking to hear us about the future. So the future of survival horror. What about indie games versus AAA, AA? So where is the genre is going for you? Where the scary games are going? Richard, you're making one now that you can talk about, but
yeah, and I think the exciting thing now when I look at the larger world of games right now, is like how many different directions it can go now versus at the time Resident Evil or Silent Hill 2, etc. came out. They were really the big game, and maybe you got 2 other horror games that year or something, right? And now you can just find things, as I was talking about in my intro, just all different types of mechanics being applied to horror. You can have a shooter that's horror, you can have a avoider that's horror, you can have like a strategy, a colony sim or something that's horror. You can really have all of these different type of genres that, or like State of Decay, that's really sort of a management sim with a little bit of an action game. And all of these things can apply to horror in different ways and really explore other spaces. And now you can play a new horror game every month, or 5 every month or something.
Well,
there's so many out there.
because
That's
so many
exciting. And
things.
they don't all have to be just the ones that got manufactured and put in a box in the store. There's just so many choices. So where
No.
is it going? Don't know, but many places.
But what is the most scary thing? The unknown.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
that's perfect for us. Let's scare us, and we don't know where we're going to go. And then Lovecraft going to come back. And so Don.
Yeah, I think technology and the way technology is moving can make a big difference. I started playing my very first games console. It wasn't a console really, had 48 kilobytes of RAM. And when you think about VR now and the things that we can do with technology in video games, I mean, I recall playing Resident Evil 7 on VR for the first time, and it was so amazingly realistic. I could almost smell inside the house in that introduction. It was horrible. Lift the lid up and you see all the squirming bits. And so I think things like VR and technology and not even having a control of the things that we can do with just our hands, I think that's going to make a huge difference to the way we can interact with video games and therefore interact with horror.
Right. Ewan?
Okay, I think both the previous speakers made some really good points. Yeah, games are moving in so many different directions. It's really hard to know exactly. Also, what kind of games are we talking about? We talk about mobile phone games, games on consoles, indie games. There is this kind of multiplicity of different titles and platforms out there. And also the issue of technology. I can go one better. I started on a ZX81, which had 1K of memory, was silent and black and white. So that's eventually so that's where I began. And now we've got these photorealistic headsets, but then at the same time we also have games like Signalis, which is much more kind of like low budget. There's something about the horror genre which seems to fit with kind of like producers with little resources. If you think about like how many sort of exploitation filmmakers started making horror films because they're relatively cheap, something like Slender Man or Five Nights at Freddy's, which were these massive phenomenon which started off developed into either from or into very small low budget games which have been very impactful. I think the horror is going to be around. It's been around since games started being made. It's always been one of the most impactful genres alongside fantasy and science fiction. And I think it will continue to evolve as the technology and the culture of games develop over the next few years.
Right. So I'm buying everything that's coming on horror. So game design deep dive. Joshua Beiser is talking about this notion of micro horror. Short games. Friday night at what of the word? Tell me something. I have a blank too.
Five Nights at Freddy's.
What?
No. Five Nights at Freddy's.
Five Nights at Freddy's. I have mixing terms. I was, but again, now we have all those indie designers like making short games that are sometimes self-reflexive, that are going back to PlayStation 1 aesthetics. And then they're really building those scary, uncanny atmosphere. And I do think that will not stop. I'm teaching in the department where we're doing game design, and then our students are making horror games, and then people are jumping because they start to learn their skill and their craft. So I do think that and that's why we're good on Steam, and then there's many short games that are, and I do think that's gonna help to keep this genre alive. And then I know, so we did refer to VR. So Resident Evil just changed something from first person, and then for instance, I did jump in The Walking Dead, Saint and Sinner. And then at one point, there's another experience. I'm a zombie fan, and then VR is bringing something. So again, I do think that the scope of the experience that we're gonna have is expanding, which is good for us when we like the genre. And then there's a question that's funny, because there's a question that we didn't answer about the technological limitation of the genre, which at one point, there will be no technical limitation. But here, we're maybe not still in a real reality. We feel the grain, but at one point we'll not have that. But do we still? And then that's the point that I want to make. We don't need to have this perfect photorealistic images to be scared. That's what you were going back to the ZX Spectrum E1. And then we have this dissonance historical perspective now, because that's not that. In the Dark was not very scary, because that was the first polygonal character on fixed background. But I'm not sure that when I played the first time that that was scary. So we with the notion of gameplay, and then the fact that whatever we do in a horror game, you have to survive. That's the theme of our session today. And then I'm not sure that that all games are horror, but at one point, being run around by a monster, will always be scary. Or to not knowing when the monster is coming, because I'm thinking about the radio, knowing there is a danger around, and then be afraid of what's coming.
Absolutely.
So I do think that Sean's going to come back to the screen at that time. He's a ghost for now in the system, but he's back.
Hello, everybody. I'm back. Again, thank you so much for that engaging discussion. It was just really interesting to hear all your thoughts on just all the different, answering all the different questions from all over the world. So thank you again for that. While you guys were discussing, we were watching the live chat, and we actually received a couple of questions. So I'd like to get into that right now. This one, actually, the first one we have is specifically for Dr. Kirkland, and perhaps Dawn can also chime in here as well, especially it's talking about the Gothicness of a game. So the question says, I noticed that you included Night in the Woods as a contemporary Gothic game in your presentation, and I was wondering if you could just, list the reasons why it can be considered as such.
Okay, yeah. So Night in the Woods, if anyone hasn't played it, is about a character returning home and finding their home has changed since they've been away for the last few months. So that's often a trope within a lot of Gothic fiction. It's also about this kind of economic decline of this town that the character lives in. It's got kind of a lot of spooky elements to it. There's possibly an abduction at one point during the game, but you're not sure if the character is imagining it. So you've got that sense of uncertainty. One of the designers did actually use the term Rust Belt Gothic to define the game. So I was kind of taking my cue from their interview. Dawn, have you got anything to add to that?
I'm just going to drop the word unheimlich. I think Night in the Woods is very, very unheimlich. So it's almost homely, but there's something, that undercurrent of not homeliness, and that goes back to what you said at the start. She comes home at the very beginning of the game, and things aren't the same as they were. And I think that that feeds into the whole game, doesn't it? I think.
But it's also, if anyone hasn't played it, I really recommend it. It's really, really. Even though I said it's Gothic, it's also really sweet, and it's really it has a lot of heart in it.
But a lot of different themes as well, hasn't it? So it's not just touching on the Gothic; it's touching on gender and, like you said, about economics and economic decline and lots of other things as well.
Yeah, and we're talking about those games, Little Nightmare 1 and 2. When you say it's scary game, but at the same time, there's something cute and then interesting in the experience.
Yeah, it goes right back to what Ewan was saying really earlier about the uncanny.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. This is actually kind of a great point that you made about the economic anxieties and the decline, actually, because the second question asks, do the speakers see Japan's economic anxieties of the late 90s having any impact on the way the terrors or the antagonists of the major series discussed today? And could those economic anxieties be part of why survival became such a major theme in Japanese media back then, especially with movies such as Battle Royale coming out?
Well, like I said, we're not Japanese specialists, but I do think it makes sense. I was looking at the episode 16 on horror with the notion of technology. So at one point, the genre of horror is all about the anxiety of the society at one point in time. So the fact that there's a spirit or there's something that the past is coming back to us. The economic of the future is based on the economic of the past. As older people, you're responsible for the people of coming after you. So at one point, I do not see how that distinguish of not knowing where where you're going to be, how the society will evolve. It's part of the Japanese-ness of creating those more psychological game of being afraid, not kind of facing a big obstacle, but they have this anxiety. So at one point, where we're going, Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, Yuan, about ghosts, there's maybe this notion of anxiety, terror and anxiety that may be linked to this socio-economical and political aspect of Japan at the time that the game were made. It's a great point. It's a great point.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess that we'll just go back to we're going back to the PS1 and PS2 era questions, I guess. Why do you think the PS1 and PS2 era was the so-called peak of survival horror before, the turning into the survival action, as Dr. Perron described? Was this because of the new possibilities of the technology that allowed for experiences that players could more easily insert themselves into, therefore bringing the anxiety of the game closer and dismantling some of the safety from the distance of the media? I know we kind of touched upon that, but if you could, maybe explain more about that.
Richard, you have to jump on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think an interesting thing to think about in terms of like Resident Evil specifically and the technology, the PlayStation 1. I mentioned the thing about it was able to be very pretty because the backgrounds were pre-rendered. That worked with the graphical horsepower, but also the original PlayStation controller didn't have sticks on it. It only had the D-pad. So when you're playing with like those tank controls in Resident Evil 1, they're really built to work with a D-pad. If they'd had a directional stick to work with, that might have led to a different game. So at that point in time, when the PlayStation first came out, before the DualShock controller was introduced as an add-on, they couldn't really do a shooter on a console. Like Doom was very big on PC, but would not be, that type of shooter would not be very popular until around the PlayStation 2 era when games, when Halo came out on the original Xbox and things like that, and the shooter started taking over the space more in terms of action games. So it was very much I think the success of those games was a bit of a product of the control that, was available on those systems at the time.
Yeah, it's a beautiful paradox. So the visual and the audio can come to be photorealistic, but at the same time, the control are not that great. So you cannot run around very easily. So like the notion of surviving is really much more present than having a gun where you get a laser and you can shoot where you want. And then we know in the first Resident Evil, the shooting was not perfect. You had to decide, and that's it. So it was really part of the DNA. So survival horror may be part of the fact that, the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2. For me, you can stop at PlayStation 2 and I'm going to play a PlayStation game and I'm going to be scared. I don't need the photorealistic dimension of the game right now to be afraid, because it's all about, gameplay. And I think PlayStation 1 was perfect for that. It arrived with bad control, good graphic enough to just put out in Raccoon City or anywhere, and then afterwards that was all about trying to survive in space.
Thank you. The next question, it's going to change topics a little bit, but there seems to be a scholarship about ways disability is monsterified, but is there any overlap you see between survival horror studies and disability studies? And how much of survival horror seems to be talked about in terms of weakness and helplessness and the loss of control of the body and the ability to act on the environment?
But again, this is what you want to just go.
Yeah, I have to say I haven't read anything, I haven't encountered anything about disability studies and games. I think it's a really fruitful area to explore, because I think one of the things games are often about is able-bodiedness. The character at the center is this able-bodied, often this kind of superhero character, and we do see tropes of disability represented in horror monsters. So I think there is something to be written there. I've encountered quite a lot of stuff, disability studies in relation to comic books. That does seem to be an area that's growing, but and in film, but not in video games. But I think it is definitely it seems like an obvious direction for that particular branch of scholarship to go.
Yeah, we did. There's a new chapter in the Companion to Video Game Studies, second edition, about disability, because it's now part of video games, as much as a representation and as much for the player too. To make people playing the game as much as possible, whatever you're able to do or not. And yeah, so Ewan just wrote very nice things about monster and stuff like that. And I do think that's if we're talking about representation, there's something there. But I don't know who's asking the question, but it's a good topic for a master or PhD. Just go.
So if you think about Clock Tower, for example, and Phenomena and how they use physical disabilities in their bad guys, and things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and some of their characters, I think that it has been used a lot to demonize disability throughout the genre. So not just video games, throughout the whole field. But I agree, it's right for somebody to come and look at it.
Yeah, that's interesting too. I mean, even in James Bond, usually the villains have some kind of, like disfigurement or something, and they're always like the bad guy in that kind of scenario.
Yeah.
So I think this is going to be our last question for the evening, and this kind of touches upon, I guess, a slightly less popular form of horror game, which is the text-based horror games. I know we haven't really touched much upon it. But how do you think immersion works in that sort of setting where the story unfolds like a novel, rather than the player having the freedom to explore, the world, the scary world, and uncovering the story for themselves?
So Doki Doki Literature Club,
Yes.
Literature Club that we cannot not talk about. But again, it's all about psychological. I'm coming from cinema, so maybe I'm not the right person to talk about that, because for me it's about sound and images. But I do read a lot of horror fiction, and it's all about you getting in and then putting your mind and imagine the world around. And I do think that visual novel already good to do that. Just suddenly you're clicking, and then the mood change, and then you're putting yourself into that position. So there's just again, for me, there's the engagement that visual novel do ask. And sometimes, for some people, Eric Kotick that is really working on visual novels, it's a bad genre. People in a walking simulator, visual novel or not, video games, like we're thinking about it because they're not hard, and then you're not doing anything, but just go in. I don't know, Doki Doki. You just go into it, and then suddenly you're just starting to imagine stuff, and then literature do that pretty well. And then I do think that visual novel can do that as well. And then, adding the minimal visual to it. But it just, I'll call that a trampoline, something to jump on and to go in your own mind.
Yeah, a trampoline. Perhaps.
Trampoline, merci,
Yes.
merci Richard.
Yes.
So there's, it's always like that. Horror or terror or fear is about you need to think about something, and then your mind is going on. And then you can do that in comic book. I'm here, that's what I'm reading those days. I love that. Ito is amazing. And I'm just, those drawing, those stories are making me, and it's comic book. but it's all your mind. I do think maybe we're going to finish on that. So Lovecraft was saying in his book that, people like horror or a different part of society, or are the lucky one that are smart enough to be able to jump in a story and be afraid. Because so many people that are, stuck in reality, they cannot imagine the uncanny, cannot imagine the fantastic, cannot imagine the strange. And then losing all those experiences that we do have as horror scholar, as horror designer, living through those experiences that are making us alive. And at one point, that's the best memories. And I do think that we can go around and we can ask people online right now, and people are going to look at that. The best remembrance that we have of games. I felt alive when I was playing a horror game, a scary game. On the lake on Silent Hill 2, you just go on the lake, if something would happen. It's one of the greatest moments that I have in my life. In New Nightmare, in the Red Dead Redemption, I turned myself and I was killed by a horde of zombies. Then I was alive. So be alive, play horror games and scary games because it makes us alive.
Thank you. Well, I guess that's all the time that we have for today's session. So I'd like to give a big thanks to our special guest speakers, Bernard, Ewan, Dawn, and Richard. Thank you again for joining us and sharing your time and expertise with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks to everyone. Thank you.
As always, please just subscribe to our YouTube channel and newsletter if you haven't done so already to see what events we have planned next. And to add to that, it would be really helpful if you could just fill out the quick survey and tell us what topics you'll be interested in seeing for future episodes. And you can find the link for that in the description box below. So again, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having you at the next session. Take care.